Hello everyone and welcome to the data analysis class that you did not sign up for, but now you're here. Today I wanted to talk about my 2020 bookish stats because last year I actually had a spreadsheet which I will link down below, and it is created by reader Voracious, and they have a template that has so many different features to track your reading and your bookish life. They have a page for 2020 reads, 2020 hauls, the owned books you have, and whether or not you read those owned books. They have 2020 content calendars, etc., etc. I customized this template that Reader Voracious created to fit my own needs and to fit the information that I wanted to collect throughout the year because I really enjoy statistics and I enjoy graphs and I enjoy just tracking different information throughout the year. So I thought it would be interesting to show you my 2020 reading stats because I asked people on Twitter if they would be interested in this and they said yes. So here you go. We're going to talk about stats. I'm going to show you graphs and I hope you're interested as much as I am because I think this type of stuff is very nifty. So the first thing that I want to talk about are the books that I read per month, and I want to talk about the different months where I read a lot of books and then months where I didn't read a lot. So I have 2 months where I read the same amount of books, and they are the most amount of books that I read in 2020 per month, and it is June and November. I read 14 books during those 2 months, and I don't know how I did it. It was probably because I read really short novels. So I don't really remember what happened in June, but I think the reading rush happened, which might have contributed to me reading so many books in 1 month. I also think I read a lot of audiobooks as well as short books, and I was able to complete 14 books in 1 month, which I think is the most amount of books I've ever read in a month, which is really cool. And in November, where I also read 14 books, I think I did the same thing where I read a lot of short books and a lot of audiobooks because audiobooks get me through the whole entire year. I did not pick up a lot of books physically this year, and it's audiobooks that really saved me in terms of reading a large amount of books because I can fly through audiobooks pretty quickly. I could probably read them quicker if I listened to them for a longer amount of time rather than playing them throughout the day, but I was able to read 14 books in both June and November, and that's really cool. And the month that I read the least amount of books was August. August was the month that my chronic illness really flared up and I was just not physically or mentally capable of reading a lot of books. So I think those 4 books that I read in August were probably audiobooks. I don't think I remember reading anything physically because I just physically was not able to. So that was the month that I read the least amount of books. So let's move on to something else. Are you excited by these graphs as much as I am? Because I can't wait to show you. Reader Voracious created a table to track your reading by source. So you can either have a book be logged as you bought it for yourself, it's an ARC, you borrowed it, or it was a gift. So my most popular reading source was borrowed. And for me, borrowed was borrowed from the library or borrowed from Libby. I use Libby a lot for audiobooks, and you already know I read audiobooks the most out of anything else. So the most amount of things that I read by source was borrowed, and that was 48 books which were borrowed. So 48 books that I borrowed from my library, which I'm really proud of because I read 100 books this year, so almost half of it was borrowed from the library. Then we have reading format, so you can either have audiobook, hardcover, paperback, or ebook. My most popular reading format was audiobook, obviously. I read 38 audiobooks this year, and my runner-up was paperbacks, and I read 29 paperbacks this year. I don't tend to read a lot of hardcovers because hardcovers mostly mean new releases for me, and I tend to not hurry up and buy new releases because I've really cut back on my book buying, so it's not a surprise that hardcover is not the most popular because I don't tend to buy a lot of new releases. I tend to borrow them from my library instead. Now let's move on to my favorite graph because I loved watching it change throughout the year whenever I logged in a new book, and it is my books by genre pie chart. This pie chart is just so pleasing for me to look at. I don't know why I love pie charts so much. I just think they're fascinating. So my most popular genre that I read in 2020 was contemporary. I read 18 contemporary novels, and that counted for 18% of my pie chart because I read 100 books this year, so it's very easy to understand. My second most read genre was historical fiction, which is no surprise there. I love historical fiction. I'm surprised that's not my leading genre, but I did read 17 of those, so I was only one book behind. Then a surprising runner-up for third place is fantasy. I don't know how fantasy got in there as my third most read genre, considering I don't really enjoy fantasy, but apparently in 2020 I picked up 13 fantasy books, so that's a very big surprise for me. Now let's move on to my least read genres. So the genres that I only read one book of was science fiction. That's no surprise there. The one science fiction novel that I read was Moon of the Crusted Snow, which was actually really good, and I highly recommend it. So that's a surprise there because I didn't think I read a science fiction novel this year. Another genre that I barely picked up was thriller and horror. So I read one book for each of those genres, and let's find out what books they were. I know one of them was Mexican Gothic. That was the horror book. And then the thriller book that I read was Leave the World Behind, which was such a good book. It's in my top books of 2020. I really enjoyed it, and it really took me by surprise. Let's break down my ratings. So the most popular rating that I gave out was 4 stars, which is no surprise because I did not have a good reading year for 2020. So it seems that there were 23 books that I gave 4 stars that didn't really make it to 5 stars, didn't really make it into a new favorite of mine. Now let's break down my reading by age range in terms of the novels that I read. So the most amount of novels that I read were adult fiction. I read 65 adult fictions this year, and I read 27 young adult books this year. I'm finding myself straying away from young adult fiction. While I do enjoy it sometimes, it's not something that really calls to me anymore, and I'm much more gravitating towards adult fiction, which I really enjoy and I'm having a lot of fun with. So reading 65 adult fictions this year is a pretty big feat for me, and I never thought I would read so many adult fictions in one year, but here we are now, looking at graphs, telling you the types of books that I'm reading throughout 2020. Now moving on to the one sheet in the spreadsheet where you can track your 2020 reads by the dates that you read them, the title, the author of the series, what year it was published, the genre, the audience, etc., etc. This is a spreadsheet that is like pretty tedious to fill out every time you finish a book, but it also generates all those graphs that I have to show you all. So the book that took me the longest amount of time to finish was The Girls in the Picture, and it took me 54 days to finish this book. And this is actually one of my favorite reads of 2020, which I find to be so interesting, but I think it's because I picked it up physically before and I was trying to get through it. I was reading a couple pages a day and I was in a really big reading slump. So it wasn't the book's fault, it was more my fault. So it took me a long time to finally bite the bullet and take out the book on audiobook, and then I read it and finished it on audiobook. So somehow it took me from August to October to finish this book. But then again, remember in August, I was physically unable to read. I was very ill. It was just not a good time. So it's no surprise that I did not finish in August, and that's when I picked it up. And that's when I was really struggling to pick it up because I was going through so many other things in my personal life. So it's no surprise that this book took me so long to finish, but it did take me 54 days to finish The Girls in the Picture. Now, the oldest book that I read this year was A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. This was published in 1596. Other than that, all the other books that I read were pretty modern. They were in the 2000s, and I think there was another Shakespearean play that I read that was from the 1600s, I believe. So the oldest book that I read was A Midsummer Night's Dream. And the longest book that I read was Chain of Gold by Cassandra Clare. This was 582 pages for the ARC version that I have, and that is the longest book that I picked up because we all know that I don't like picking up books over like 400 pages. I just don't think that books need to be longer than 400 pages. It's my hot opinion. I just think that people need to edit down their stories, and I think no story needs to be 500 plus pages except A Little Life. So Chain of Gold was the longest book that I read, and the runner-up was my reread of Clockwork Princess, which I think is one of the only few books that I reread this year was the Infernal Devices series. I had a lot of fun rereading that. It really brought me back into the feels of the Shadowhunter world, and it was a fun time, but I don't tend to reread a lot of books often. And lastly, I wanted to tell you about how many books I acquired this year and how many I read of those books that I acquired this year. So I acquired 63 books this year. Either I bought them, people gifted them to me, publishers gifted them to me, or I think that's it. But I had acquired 63 books this year, and out of those 63 books, I read 44 of them. So I did the math. Hopefully it's right. And I read 70% of the books that I acquired this year, which I think is really good. Usually I will let some books sit on my TBR for a long amount of time, but I also have a very small TBR. So I think I was able to tackle the books that were coming into my life in 2020 quicker than usual than just letting it sit on my TBR. So I'm really proud of the fact that out of the 63 books I acquired this year, I read 70% of those already. So I'm hoping to finish the other 30% in 2021. So those are all my stats for 2020. I hope this video wasn't that boring, and I hope you found it a little bit interesting to look at my pie charts and my little graphs and all that jazz, because I think it's interesting and I think it's a fun way to break down your reading and really dissect it in case you want to improve as a reader, in case you want to focus on a specific genre next year, in case you want to focus on reading the books that you acquired this year. And yeah, I just think it was a very interesting thing to do. I'm really grateful for Reading Voracious for creating this spreadsheet because it's really comprehensive and really user-friendly. So I will link that down below in case you're curious to use it yourself. I'm most definitely going to be using it in 2021 because I think it's a fun way to just look at your reading in a very comprehensive way through graphs and all that jazz. So I think it's very cool. Let me know what were the longest books that you read this year. Let me know what's the genre that you read the most. Let me know all about that because I actually would really love to know. I find it fascinating, as you can tell by me making this video. So I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I will see you in another one. Bye!